Chapter 3. I thought of Caroline. 17 years old. Detained for trying to protect people from the regime. I thought of Linda standing in my study asking me what DPM meant. I thought of myself 3 weeks ago, glancing at the clock and worrying about being late for dinner. The archive room was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the rows of filing cabinets, I could hear Gerald moving about. The ordinary sounds of a morning at work, documents being processed, records being filed, the machinery of administration turning smoothly. I closed the folder and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Eventually I stood and returned the folders to their cabinet. I managed to sign the retrieval log with steady handwriting that looked nothing like how I felt inside. Gerald glanced up as I passed his desk. "Find what you needed?" "Yes." "Thank you." I took the stairs back down to my floor. My legs felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The corridor was busier now, other administrators arriving, voices echoing, doors opening and closing. A normal morning at work. I reached my office and closed the door behind me. The pending authorization folder sat on my desk where I'd left it, with its 23 approvals awaiting my signature. I opened it and began reading the first form. District 9 South. Residential relocation. 12 families. Destination, Regional Housing Complex B. Classification, Standard. I moved to pick up my pen, and stopped. How many of these had I approved over the years? Hundreds? Thousands? How many had included attachments I'd never read, protocols I'd never questioned, classifications I'd never understood? How many children had vanished because I'd been worried about being late for dinner? I pushed the folder away and picked up the telephone. The detention center was listed in the internal directory under Compliance Operations. I dialed the main number. Compliance Operations, Central Processing. How may I direct your call? Ronald Harker, Regional Review Administration. I need to access a detention file for a juvenile currently in holding. One moment, please. A series of clicks. Then a different voice, male, board, juvenile records. What's the case number? I don't have the case number. The detainee's name is Caroline Brennan. Brennan, detained Tuesday afternoon. Keys clicking. Let me pull that up. What's your clearance level? Level 2 regional. More clicking. A pause. It's showing the file as restricted access. You'll need level 3 or higher. On what grounds? Doesn't say. Just flagged as restricted. He sounded faintly apologetic. If you need access, you'll have to submit a formal request through your supervisor. The same bureaucratic wall I'd hit with Susan Fletcher. I see. Thank you. I hung up before he could offer any more unhelpful suggestions. Caroline's file was restricted. That meant someone senior had specifically limited who could access it. Someone who wanted to control what information got out. My father, most likely. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. 2 problems occupied my mind. I needed to delay the Tuesday sweep in District 7 East. And I needed to find out what was happening to Caroline. Both required access to information I wasn't supposed to have. Both would leave traces if I pursued them through official channels. And both were presumably already being monitored by people who had far more authority than I did. My father's voice echoed in my mind, "Your role is verification, Ronald. Not investigation. The distinction matters." He'd drawn the boundary clearly. I could process documents all day long. Sign authorisations. Move paper from one tray to another. That was verification, the careful, limited function I'd been hired to perform. But investigating what those documents meant? Questioning where the authorisations led? That crossed into territory I had no right to enter. Except I'd already crossed it. The moment I'd filed that query about District 7 East. The moment I'd promised Linda I'd buy her time. The moment I'd looked at those permanent holding protocols and understood what I'd been signing. I couldn't uncross it now. I pulled my address book from the desk drawer and flipped through it. Most of the entries were colleagues, people I worked with, saw at meetings, exchanged procedural memos with. Professional relationships, carefully maintained at arm's length. But there were a few that went back further. People I'd known before the regime consolidated. Before the Viroflux contagion changed everything. David Osman. We'd started in the civil service together just over 30 years ago. He'd moved into systems administration while I'd gone into population review, different divisions, different specialties. But we'd stayed in touch over the years, we had lunch occasionally. Our wives knew each other. David had level for clearance. High enough to access restricted files. High enough to pull detention records without raising immediate flags. I picked up the telephone and dialed his extension. Osman. David. It's Ronald Harker. Do you have a moment? Ronald. Good to hear from you. What can I do for you? I was wondering if you might be free for lunch today. There's something I'd like to discuss. A pause. Just long enough to suggest he'd heard something in my voice. Today? I'm fairly busy, but yes, I think I can manage that. The usual place. Perfect. Noon. I'll see you then. I hung up and checked my watch. 3 hours. The pending authorization folder sat in front of me. 23 forms waiting for my signature. I pulled the first one towards me and read it again, more carefully this time. District 9 South. 12 families. Destination, Regional Housing Complex B. I opened my desk drawer and removed the internal facility directory. Flipped to the housing section. Found Regional Housing Complex B listed on page 47. Capacity, 200 units. Classification, Standard Residential. Status, Active. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. But I'd thought the same thing about RT7. I picked up my pen, then put it down again. Pulled out a fresh notepad and began writing a list of questions. What is Regional Housing Complex B? Where is it located? How long has it been operational? What classifications are housed there? What protocols govern transfers? For each of the 23 pending authorizations, I wrote similar questions. By the time I finished, I'd filled 4 pages. My hand ached. The clock on the wall showed 9:15. I looked at the forms spread across my desk. At the neat columns of information, the proper signatures, the correct codes. All of it formatted exactly as the regulations required. All of it, potentially, as meaningless as the authorization I'd signed 3 weeks ago. I couldn't approve them. Not without knowing where they led. But I couldn't reject them either. Not without cause. Not without documentation explaining my reasoning. I gathered the forms together and placed them back in the folder. Then I put the folder in my desk drawer and locked it. 23 families. However many children. All waiting for my signature. They'd have to wait longer. There was a knock at my door. I glanced at the clock again, 9:30. Too early for David. Come in. Jeffrey Harrison stepped into my office. District 6 Central Coordinator. I'd been thinking about him just last night, reviewing his population figures. Ronald. Hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all. Please, sit down. He settled into the chair across from my desk. Jeffrey was perhaps 10 years younger than me, still carrying that earnest efficiency of someone who believed the work mattered. We'd collaborated on several district coordination projects over the years. He was thorough, careful, reliable. He was also holding a folder marked with my office code. I received a rather odd message this morning, he said. From the records archive. Apparently you pulled my Q2 district files first thing. My stomach dropped. Gerald's retrieval log. Of course he'd noted which files I'd accessed. Yes, I said carefully. I was reviewing some cross-district data for a quarterly analysis. Nothing urgent. I see. Jeffrey didn't look entirely convinced. The thing is, I also received a memo yesterday afternoon asking me to report any unusual inquiries related to District 7 East population movements. The air in the room seemed to thin. From whom? Senior Regional Administration. They didn't specify why. Just said to flag anything that seemed out of the ordinary. He paused. Is everything all right, Ronald? I had perhaps 3 seconds to decide how to respond. Jeffrey was a colleague. Not a friend, exactly, but someone I'd worked with for years. Someone who'd always seemed decent, competent, conscientious. Someone who'd also just told me he'd been asked to monitor my activities. Everything's fine, I said. The analysis I'm working on is routine. Population variance tracking across multiple districts. I should have mentioned it to you beforehand, professional courtesy. I apologize for the oversight. No need to apologize. I just wanted to make sure. He trailed off. You know how it is. When senior administration asks us to keep an eye out for things, we have to follow through. Of course. I understand completely. He stood, still holding the folder. If you need any additional information from my district, just let me know. I'm happy to provide whatever you need through proper channels. Thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate that. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. I sat very still, processing what had just happened. They were already watching. Already monitoring who accessed district files. Already asking coordinators to report unusual inquiries. My father's doing, probably. Or whoever my father had alerted after our telephone conversation last night. The net was tightening before I'd even begun. I checked my watch again. 2 hours until lunch with David. 2 hours to decide whether I was really going to do this. Whether I was going to ask a friend to violate security protocols, access restricted files, and potentially destroy his career. Whether I was going to burn down 30 years of careful, respectable service for the sake of a granddaughter who'd broken the law and families I'd never met. The telephone rang. I stared at it for 3 rings before picking up. Harker. Ronald. It's Margaret. Her voice was strained. You need to come home. My heart lurched. What's happened? Your father's here. He's waiting in the sitting room. He says he needs to speak with you urgently. How odd. He must have known I'd be at the office at this time. Did he say what about? I asked. No. But Ronald. She lowered her voice. He brought someone with him. A man in a security services uniform. The world tilted. Tell him I'll be there in 30 minutes. He said it couldn't wait. 30 minutes, Margaret. I need to finish something here first. I hung up before she could argue. My hands were shaking now. I pressed them flat against the desk and breathed carefully, the way I'd learned to do during the early pandemic years when the anxiety threatened to overwhelm everything. My father. At my house. With security services. That wasn't a friendly visit. That was an official intervention. I looked at the locked desk drawer containing the pending authorization forms. At the notepad covered with questions I shouldn't be asking. At the telephone I'd used to call David Osman. Everything in this office was about to be searched. Everything I'd accessed, everyone I'd contacted, every document I'd touched, all of it would be reviewed and catalogued and used to build a case. I'd run out of time. I unlocked the desk drawer and removed the authorization folder. Carried it to the filing cabinet and put it in the standard holding location where it would have gone if I'd simply processed it normally. Made it look like I'd been planning to address it later in the day. The notepad with my questions went into my jacket pocket. Then I locked my office and walked down the corridor to the lift. Jeffrey Harrison was standing by the water cooler, talking with Susan Fletcher from Facility Operations. They both looked up as I passed. I nodded pleasantly and kept walking. The morning was bright and cold when I stepped outside. The city streets were busy with people heading to work, queuing at checkpoints, moving through the choreographed patterns of daily survival. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. 30 years. That was how long I'd spent learning the system. Understanding its rhythms, its procedures, its careful language. Becoming the sort of administrator who could be trusted to verify without investigating. 3 days. That was how long it had taken for that entire career to crack apart. I turned the key in the ignition. My father would be waiting. Security services would be waiting. Questions would be asked that I wouldn't be able to answer without incriminating myself, or Linda, or Caroline, or all of us together. But I had 30 minutes before I got there. 30 minutes to decide what I was going to say. 30 minutes to decide who I was going to be. I pulled out of the car park and headed home, trying not to think about the fact that this might be the last time I made this journey as a free man. I drove through familiar streets. Past the checkpoint just outside the government complex where Harry always waved me through without checking credentials. Past the bakery that had closed last month and still hadn't reopened. Past the queue at the health assessment station that stretched around the block. The turning for my street came up on the right. The sign read Oakwood Crescent in neat black letters. I didn't take it. My hand stayed on the wheel. My foot stayed on the accelerator. I watched the turning recede in the mirror and kept driving. The realization came slowly. Not the decision that had already made itself somewhere beneath conscious thought. If my father was waiting with security services, then I'd already lost. The moment I walked through that door, the conversation would move in only one direction. Formal questions. Careful answers that would be picked apart and analyzed. Reminders about loyalty and duty and the necessity of maintaining order. And at the end of it, I'd either capitulate completely or be taken somewhere for a more thorough conversation. Either way, Caroline would remain in detention. The Tuesday sweep would proceed. The families in District 7 East would be processed according to protocols I'd approved without understanding. And the regime would continue functioning exactly as designed. The only variable in that equation was me. Whether I cooperated quickly or slowly. Whether I made it easy or difficult. But the outcome was already determined. So I kept driving. Past residential streets that gave way to commercial districts. Past government buildings with their security barriers and identification checkpoints. Past the orderly facade that made this all seem normal and necessary and inevitable. My father would wait. Margaret would make tea. The security services officer would sit patiently in the sitting room, taking notes, observing everything. They'd wait 30 minutes, maybe 40. Then they'd start making calls. To my office. To my mobile. To colleagues who might know where I'd gone. Eventually they'd realize I wasn't coming. That realization would trigger its own cascade of consequences. Flags in the system. Alerts to checkpoints. My identification card logged as non-compliant. The machinery shifting from patient observation to active pursuit. I'd bought myself a few hours at most. Maybe less. But I'd bought them outside the sitting room. Outside my father's careful management. Outside the boundaries he'd drawn so clearly last night. The city center fell away behind me. The buildings grew smaller, more scattered. Industrial zones. Warehouses. The kind of areas where registry oversight was lighter because fewer people lived here to process and track and categorize. I pulled into a service station and parked near the back, away from the street. Turned off the engine and sat there listening to the tick of cooling metal. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped, along with the acceptance of being about to burn down everything I'd built, and standing in the ashes, wondering what came next. I'd spent 3 decades as a loyal servant of the system. 30 years processing paperwork, maintaining order, keeping my head down and doing the work. 30 years telling myself that was enough. That verification mattered. That someone had to keep the machinery running smoothly even if they didn't understand what the machinery actually did. Now I understood. And understanding had stripped away every justification I'd ever constructed. The regime didn't need me to question or investigate or think. It needed me to sign forms. To move paper from one tray to another. to transform human beings into units and classifications and administrative corrections without ever asking where those corrections led. I'd been very good at that job. I pulled the notepad from my jacket pocket and looked at the questions I'd written this morning. 4 pages of careful inquiry about facilities and protocols and processing procedures. They wouldn't help Caroline. They wouldn't stop the sweep. They wouldn't change anything about how the system operated. But they might help me understand what I'd been part of. What I'd enabled. What my signature at the bottom of authorization forms had actually meant. I tore the pages from the notepad and folded them into my wallet. I sat in the car park and thought about leverage. My father understood systems. He'd built his career on understanding how pressure moved through administrative hierarchies. How to apply it. How to resist it. How to use family connections as tools when convenient and sever them when they became liabilities. He'd brought security services to my house because he wanted me to understand my position. To see clearly that my curiosity about District 7 East and Caroline's detention were connected in ways that made both problems mine to solve by capitulating. But leverage worked both ways. If I disappeared, my father would need to explain why his son had fled rather than face a routine conversation. He'd need to account for a senior regional administrator going non-compliant. Questions would be asked about whether he'd managed the situation properly, whether family sentiment had compromised his judgment, whether the issue had been flagged soon enough. My vanishing act would create complications for him. Professional ones. And Margaret. Linda. The rest of the family. They'd be questioned, monitored, watched for signs of contact. Every movement tracked. Every conversation analyzed. I turned them into leverage against themselves. The notepad pages crinkled in my wallet as I shifted in the seat. Those questions wouldn't save anyone. Neither would meeting David for lunch, a meeting I'd now miss, leaving him to wonder what had happened, possibly drawing him into an investigation he had no part in. But it would still be safer for him than if I did meet him now. I couldn't protect Caroline this way. Couldn't stop the Tuesday sweep. Couldn't undo what I'd signed 3 weeks ago when I'd been worried about being late for dinner. All I'd done was ensure that everyone I cared about would suffer the consequences of my belated conscience. My father was right about one thing: the system would take care of itself. It always did. It would process Caroline according to proper procedures. It would conduct the sweep on Tuesday morning. It would investigate my absence and draw appropriate conclusions. And eventually it would restore order by removing the disruption I'd created. I pulled out my mobile and stared at it. 1 call to David to cancel lunch. 1 call to Margaret to, what? Apologize? Explain? Tell her I'd made a terrible mistake and was coming home? I could restart the car. Drive back to Oakwood Crescent. Walk into the sitting room where my father waited with security services and answer their questions. Cooperate fully. Demonstrate that I understood my error and was prepared to correct it. Caroline would remain detained, but perhaps my cooperation would count for something in her classification review. Perhaps they'd show leniency to a 17-year-old girl whose grandfather had recognized his mistake and returned to proper channels. Perhaps the system would be merciful. I looked at the notepad pages folded in my wallet. At the questions I'd written about facilities I'd never visited, protocols I'd never questioned, classifications I'd never understood. 30 years of careful ignorance. Then I put the mobile back in my pocket without making any calls. The system was never merciful. I thought about suicide. The word arrived in my mind, fully formed. Not an impulse, but a calculation. Another administrative solution to an administrative problem. Once I was dead, the investigation would shift. My questions about District 7 East would become questions about mental stability. The alternative, a senior administrator going rogue, potentially exposing operational details the regime preferred to keep quiet, that was far more dangerous. For my family, and for my colleagues. But a breakdown? That was understandable. Tragic, even. The system processed thousands of people through its machinery every year. Sometimes administrators broke under the weight. It happened. If I killed myself, they could write it off as temporary insanity. They could put my recent questions about RT7 and DPM classifications down to deteriorating judgment. A man who'd served faithfully for 30 years finally breaking under pressure nobody had noticed soon enough. They'd file the paperwork, update the registry, move on. And Caroline, perhaps they'd show mercy to the granddaughter of a man who'd suffered a mental collapse. Maybe Linda would be spared the worst of the scrutiny, and the family could salvage something from the wreckage. The notepad pages sat in my wallet, evidence of questions I shouldn't have asked. My office would be searched. My files reviewed. Every inquiry traced and catalogued. They'd find the pattern eventually: District 7 East, RT7, Caroline's detention, my sudden flight from the house where my father waited. But if I was dead, the pattern became symptoms rather than conspiracy. Proof of instability rather than investigation. I pulled the mobile from my pocket and turned it off completely. Removed the battery. They could track these things: location data, call logs, everything stored and retrievable. Ronald Harker needed to vanish convincingly. I started the car and drove. Not towards home or the office, but towards the river district, where the old bridges crossed the industrial waterway. Where the registry presence was thinner and the surveillance less comprehensive. Where people still fell through the cracks sometimes, lost to accident or misadventure or simple despair. The traffic thickened as I approached the city outskirts. Checkpoints became more frequent. I kept my identification ready, my face composed. Just another administrator running errands. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth flagging. The checkpoint guard at the River District barrier glanced at my credentials and waved me through without comment. I parked near the central bridge, the one with the walking path that ran along the railing, well over 50 feet above the fast, grey water. The one where 11 people had gone over last year during the worst of the summer outbreak. I remembered processing the registry corrections. Adding mortality codes. Updating dependent tallies where applicable. Ronald Harker was about to become one of those corrected codes.